Chapter 7. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. His room was small and cramped, being, at most, around 20 square meters. Just by standing at the door, one could see everything inside. There was a bed and a simple old wooden writing table. A few books were messily placed on top of it, one of which was lying open. A few strange and mysterious symbols could be seen on the exposed pages. An old chair was also in sight. The paint on it had been worn away, revealing the original dark color of the wood beneath. A wooden rack was sitting on one side of the room and there was a row of glass jars resting on top of it. Inside these jars were some weird half-cultivated plants and bizarre demon organs. An iron-edged wooden box was sitting in the corner of the room. There was a trash can sitting right next to it. Other than these, there was practically no other furniture in the room. A derisive look could be seen in Ellen and Fenrir's eyes. Although they were also apprentice adept, both of them were living lives that were hundreds of times better than Grimm. Not only did they have big, soft, and comfy beds in their rooms, but the luxurious decorations in their rooms was similar to that of human nobility in this world. Maybe it was because they wanted to show off their authority, but both apprentice adepts rushed into the room and began to rummage through his meager belongings. The mattress on the wooden bed was thrown to the ground, the books on the table were flipped about in a messy way, and an ink bottle was overturned, staining all the opened books with a large amount of ink. The iron-edged wooden box was opened up and all the clothes in it were dug out and thrown on the ground. Apprentice leader Anxorus merely stood at the door and watched as his men wrecked Grimm's room. He impassively looked on and did nothing to stop them. Grimm stood beside Anxorus in his sleeves. His fists were repeatedly clenching and releasing. At the same time, his eyes were filled with a cold fury. After wrecking his room, Anxorus's two lapdogs finally finished searching. Under the triumphant and snide glances of the two men, Grimm coldly shut the door. He hurried over to the overturned wooden box. After briefly searching through the pile of messy clothes, Grimm finally couldn't hold himself and cursed in a low voice. Python rat ants, rat grass, black lotus flower, wild steel flower, grave moss. After risking his life and going on so many inspection trips, the magic materials he had arduously harvested from the magic swamp were all missing. It was obvious that apprentice leader Anxorus's two henchmen had picked them up while searching for proof just now. Although he intended to rush out and confront them, when he thought of Anxorus's insidious and gloomy expression, a tremor immediately went up Grimm's spine. Clearly, these guys were using the excuse of investigating Murat's death to loot all the normal apprentices' resources. And because of Anxorus's apprentice leader status, no one dared to confront them to their faces. Of course, these three bastards wouldn't be so stupid as to provoke one of the powerful people in this tower. They were only brave enough to pick on someone weaker, like Grimm. Soon, they were knocking on the wooden door next to Grimm's. Mary's encounter was no secret to these few guys. Since she hadn't shown herself for a long time, they were taking this as an opportunity to see her current status. Apprentice leader Anxorus also wanted to know if she was still alive or not. But right when Ellen was getting so annoyed that no one was answering the door that he was about to break down the door actually opened up from the inside. A young girl wearing a red cotton dress stood in front of them. "So it's apprentice leader Anxorus. I haven't had the time to thank you for arranging my last task." The delicate voice of the young girl could easily melt anyone's heart, but that was nothing compared to the effect of her mesmerizing beauty. She had slender limbs and well-defined curves, and her skin was as fair as flawless jade. Her facial feature was delicate and perfect, and her tiny red lips were covered with a smile. But the most attracting part of her was her pair of bright blood-red eyes. They were like two pure crystal clear rubies mounted on her extraordinary face, making her as enchanting as a fairy. Also, she was wearing a bright red dress that completely exhibited her lovely body and exposed a large portion of her fair skin, dazzling anyone who saw her. In this gloomy swamp tower, the majority of the apprentice adepts wore unified grey apprentice robes and black cloaks, causing dark tones to become the main theme of this place. By bumping into a young girl with such a splendid and glaring bright appearance, these guys immediately stunned. immediately becoming tongue-tied at her charming beauty. Not only that, but after witnessing the magnificent beauty of the girl in front of them, an inexplicable lust began to surge the lower half of the three men, burning violently and bringing their more carnal hunger to life. Anxorus proved why he had been specifically chosen by the great master adept himself, as his self-control was far stronger than the other two men. While Ellen and Fenrir were seized by a sudden lust and showing horny faces, being ready to surrender their souls to this girl, Anxorus was able to pull himself out from this charm instantly. "Who are you? Quickly tell me your name," or else Anxorus's expression was changing rapidly. He took 2 steps back and hastily placed both hands in his waist pockets. Although the tower was a big place, all the apprentice adepts were pretty familiar with each other. After all, there was only about 40 to 50 people here, and they had all been living together for years, so it would be quite strange for them not to know each other. Even someone like Grimm, who was known for being unsociable and eccentric, had a couple of friends who he would communicate with, not to mention Anxorus, who was the apprentice leader that had to liaise with every apprentice each week. It would be modest to say that, with both eyes closed, Anxorus could list out all the basic living situation and status of every single apprentice adept, from level 1 to level 3, of the Adept Tower. But wait, she did come out from Mary's room. Mary, a girl who came from a remote province. The largest impression she had made on Anxorus was very stubborn. But if judging by her looks, Mary, who came from a family of nobles, was, in fact, a rare beauty amongst all the female apprentice adepts. Too bad she was ignorant of her status in the tower, as she simply ignored the countless invitations Anxorus sent, requesting her to join him in his bed on nights when he was lonely. Therefore, during an occasion when Adept Anderson urgently needed a subject to experiment on, and thus had turned to Anxorus for an apprentice adept, he had passionately recommended Mary for the position. Could it be? Thoughts were flashing through Anxorus's mind, and he quickly thought of that stubborn little beauty, who was cowardly and weak in any situation that mattered, yet had stood him up countless times. When comparing that girl to the vibrantly dressed girl who had an imposing manner in front of him, his jaw dropped and he let out a shocked cry. "You're Mary." As if hearing the name Mary caused the girl in the red dress to feel pain, her sweet and charming face suddenly twisted ferociously, causing her small cherry mouth to seem to tear open from the corners of her lips to her ears, turning her once small mouth into a gaping maw which stretched from ear to ear. With a sudden movement, the girl leapt forward, quickly biting down on Anxorus's bare neck. With a single bite, nearly half of Anxorus's neck was removed, exposing his bloody flesh and broken trachea. His blood instantly shot out, like a water fountain, and soon the floor, the wall, and the body of the girl were all stained with blood. Anxorus fell back and slammed up against the cold hard wall behind him. He slowly sliding down the wall and ended up sitting on the floor, trembling non-stop. Meanwhile, he pulled a magical item, which was shaped like a scorpion, out from his waist pocket, and triggered it, causing it to shoot out a flaming red beam toward the girl in red dress. The beam went straight through her chest. This flaming beam was a very powerful fire magic, so the intense heat of the beam instantly burned an egg-sized hole through the girl's body. The scorching beam didn't stop after passing through her body, and it even left a hole on the corridor wall behind her. After using it, Anxorus threw away the magical item. Next, with both hands trembling, he pulled a small, fist-sized bottle containing green liquid from his waist pocket. He then pulled off the bottle's cap and poured the liquid onto the huge wound on his neck. Anxorus had a pretty strong vitality, so even though he had suffered such a deadly injury, he didn't die immediately. Instead, his half-broken neck suddenly showed signs of rotting, and the exposing flesh rapidly dehydrated. At the same time, the blood spurting from his wound slowed down and eventually came to a complete stop. Partially zombified body. After learning about organic structures, anatomy, and necromancy, an apprentice adept would be able to use magic and implant a thing called a zombie sac within his body. With that, once the apprentice suffered a severe injury, the zombie sac would be triggered and make part of his body zombified, preventing him from dying due to the injury. But it was just a temporary measure. Once the instant threat of death had passed, a new threat approached. as he would now have to find a way to get rid of the violent negative energy in his body. But when faced with the choice of life and death, most apprentice adepts choose to save their lives, not matter the cost. As for the dangerous negative energy, that was something they could worry about at a later date. However, in next second a shadow was cast over his body. With one hand caressing his nearly broken neck and the other holding a small bottle up above his gaping wound, Anxorus was unable to do anything in response except turn his head to see what was happened, and what he saw was the girl in the red dress's huge bloody mouth full of sharp teeth. Her red dress was being stained purple by some liquid leaking from the hole in her chest. Purple-colored blood? Was she still human? This was the last thought that ever went through Anxorus's mind. The girl, once again, leapt forward, placing her body on top of his and latching her gaping maw onto his wounded neck. The sound of her sucking out his blood was loud and clear. As the girl was busy with her work, she was ignoring the other two apprentice adepts at her side. Both men had taken out the crude magical items they owned and readied them in their hands, but when facing with such a bloody and horrifying scene, neither of them could gather enough courage to trigger the magical items in their hands. Thinking back, even the powerful magical item of apprentice leader Anxorus couldn't cause real harm to this red-dressed monster. Perhaps the magical items in their hands would not be enough to damage her in the slightest. What if they provoked this monster? Perhaps it would leap onto their bodies next, feasting on their flesh, drinking their blood, and crushing their bones between its teeth. By the time both men had proceeded to cower up against the wall, trembling non-stop, the girl in the red dress had stopped consuming the flesh and blood of the former apprentice leader. She sat up from the body, her back facing toward these two cowardly apprentices, and took out a white handkerchief and a round-shaped small mirror. She proceeded to gently wipe her lips, a look of satisfaction covering her face. Under the effect of some mysterious healing force, the bloody purple hole on her chest started stitching itself together at an incredible rate. In the blink of the eyes, it had transformed back to the same silky smooth fair skin, and not even the tiniest scar could be seen. What a frightful regenerative ability. Could it be that she was the legendary, fearsome noble of the dark, the vampire? Through a tiny crack in his door, Grimm witnessed everything that had just happened. As for how his neighbor, who had been contaminated by a magical spell, turned into a vampire, he didn't have a single clue. But in regards to the death of the apprentice leader Anxorus, he was filled with a heartfelt joy. However, the fight had lasted for some time, and even an apprentice had been killed. No matter how insensitive the adept of the tower was, he should have sensed something by now. Grimm's mind was suddenly filled with a single thought: with all that had just happened, how was this day going to end?